Hello sports fans, welcome to Super Sports Central. Today, we're going to be looking at the current state of the UFL. So we're going to break down all the numbers from the UFL in terms of attendance and TV ratings from this past year, and also look at what the UFL could look to change moving forward. But I want to start things off talking about the TV numbers from the 2026 season. So the UFL actually had a pretty solid year when it comes to TV numbers, as they averaged 674,000 viewers per game, and that's a pretty solid number, and it was actually a slight increase from where they were in 2025, when they averaged 645,000 per game. Although both the 2025 number and 2026 number was down from where they were in their first year in 2024, where they averaged 832,000 viewers per game. Although, looking back on that, that just seems like a really good number, but it's definitely encouraging to see them go up from 2025 after it was a pretty steep drop from 2024 to 2025. But as far as individual stations go, ABC continued to be the best one for the UFL as expected. They averaged 972,000 viewers per game, and they also had 4 games average over 1 million viewers. And that is great for the UFL, obviously that's always the goal, get more than 1 million. Although it is a little disappointing it was only 4, not 5, because the championship game was just short of 1 million, as that game averaged 990,000 viewers. So that's definitely not great for a league championship, but ABC continued to still be very good for the UFL. Then as far as Fox goes, it was a pretty good year with an average of 730,000 viewers per game. And they also had 2 games average over 1 million. One of them was at like 1.3 million because that was an Indy 500 lead-in. But the thing with Fox is they have a high ceiling, and we saw that in 2024, averaging over 900,000 viewers per game. And they also had 5 games that year with over 1 million average viewers. But the thing with Fox is their Friday night games kind of drag down their average a little bit. Now, I do like the Friday night games, and I do watch parties on my channel for them every week, so it's easy to do streams for that because you know the UFL is going to be on 8 o'clock on a Friday. But the problem for the Friday night games for the UFL is they're kind of limited with how many viewers they truly pull, because they're usually in about the 600,000 range, which is pretty solid, but sometimes we see Fox numbers be a little bit better. So still a pretty good year for Fox, although I do think the Friday night games do drag their number down a little bit. Although at the same time, I do think the UFL likes having that game on Friday night, and it's pretty convenient knowing you're going to have one designated time slot where you know the UFL is going to be on throughout the season. And then moving on to their third main network, ESPN, and they average 550,000 viewers per game, and that's a pretty good number for ESPN. Although ESPN games are weird because they have a very low floor, but a very high ceiling. Because this past year, ESPN averaged as many as 940,000 viewers per game, but we've also seen their games as low as 200,000. So they're very boom or bust, but overall I think a number of 550,000 viewers per game is pretty good for the UFL on ESPN. And then the other networks, you got ESPN2, FS1, and the NFL Network. I don't really want to spend too much time on that because there's only a couple games on there each year. In fact, this was the first year there was games on the NFL Network, but there wasn't too many games, and the numbers on those networks are never really truly amazing. And moving on to attendance for the UFL, and attendance this past year was not amazing. Now, as a league, they averaged about 10,779 fans per game, and that's not a terrible number, although it is pretty disappointing when you consider the fact that that's about 2,000 less than their average from 2025, which was already down from what they averaged in 2024. So that's definitely not the most encouraging sign. And another thing that's not great is all 5 returning markets from last year to this year saw a decrease in their average attendance. But we'll start off going through each existing team that made it from 2025 to 2026. So starting off with the Stallions. So the Stallions, they're at about 8,000 fans per game, and that is decent, but it could also be a lot better. And even though 8,000 is not terrible, it could have been a lot better, and that number is also pretty inflated by one game. Because they had about 18,000 people in their first home game, but then they did not have more than 9,000 in their other 4 home games. In fact, I think one of them was about 8,000, and the rest were in the 5,000. So, not great for the Stallions, especially those 3 games that are about 5,000, when they should at least be over 10,000. And I mean, we saw they can get up to close to 20,000, 18 in their first home game, so it would definitely be a lot better if they can get that number up. But overall for the Stallions, not a great year when it comes to attendance. Moving on to the Renegades, and they're another team that saw a pretty steep decrease when it comes to attendance from last year to this year. Although I'm not really too worried about attendance for the Renegades, for a few reasons. One of them is they moved stadiums, now playing at Toyota Stadium instead of the stadium they were playing at in Arlington, which is actually a baseball field. And Toyota Stadium was under renovations for the entire season, so it really limited how many tickets the Renegades could actually sell. And another reason I'm not really too worried about the Renegades is they also had their Week 8 game played at Fort Hood, not at Toyota Stadium. And that stadium was not very big, only holding about 5,000 people, so that definitely drags down their average. But overall, I still think the Renegades will be okay when it comes to attendance, even though their number for this year wasn't very good. Next team we got is the Defenders, and their drop-off is pretty concerning, because they were down to about 9,000 fans per game, which is a drop-off of about 4,000 from 2025 to 2026. And the reason why that's concerning is the Defenders, they're coming off a league championship in 2025, so you would think excitement for the team would be at an all-time high, and instead their attendance was the worst it's ever been. So that is definitely not great. In fact, the Defenders, they only had one game this year in the regular season where they had more than 10,000 fans, after they did not have a single game in 2024 or 2025 having less than 10,000 fans. So being at 9,000 average fans for a game is not great for the Defenders, although DC did redeem themselves a little bit, selling out the championship game with a little over 19,000 tickets sold. But definitely the Defenders, seeing that decrease, especially after winning the championship, is definitely not ideal. Now, the Gamblers' attendance, it was pretty bad. There's not really much to say, besides the fact that it was not great. It's the third year in a row where their number was just not as good as the rest of the league. In fact, their 5,600 fans were worse than the league, and it's just not great when you've consistently gone down from 2024 to now. Now, obviously, the Gamblers always being a team that's not very good definitely doesn't help, but their attendance is pretty bad. And then the final existing team that made the transition from 2025 to 2026 was the Battlehawks, and they led the league in attendance as expected with about 22,000 fans per game. But despite them leading the league by quite a bit, this was still a very disappointing number for the Battlehawks. And it's also a bad sign because they've gone down from 2024 to 2025, and then from 2025 to 2026. In fact, this year, they had just one game where they had more than 30,000 fans, after they had 30,000 fans in 10 of their 13 home games from 2024 to 2025 combined. So definitely not great for the Battlehawks, although it was still good considering they were still well above league average, but definitely not what you would expect from the Battlehawks, and you would like to see that number be a lot higher. And then as far as the new teams go, for the UFL, I actually thought the new markets did pretty well. For the Aviators, they averaged about 10,000 fans per game, and that's pretty encouraging, especially considering the Aviators ended up being one of the worst teams in the UFL. Then for the Kings, they did a really good job when it comes to attendance at 11,000, or about 11,000 per game, and that's really impressive considering their stadium only holds about 14,000, and it's also impressive considering how bad of a start this team got off to. But definitely think the Kings had a great year, and they ended up being one of the best markets for the UFL this season. And then the Storm, they were under 10,000 fans per game, but they were still pretty solid, although definitely could have been a little bit better. But overall, when talking about attendance for the UFL, I definitely don't think it's a great sign how the attendance has pretty steadily dropped from 2024 to now, although the good news for the UFL, I don't think it's something that is completely unfixable. But now when you have attendance dropping for certain teams, it definitely brings up the question of should the UFL relocate them, and specifically talking about the Stallions and Gamblers. And I understand where the question's coming from, but my answer is a firm no for both teams for multiple reasons, and we're going to start with the Stallions. So they have a very strong fan base. Now obviously the attendance hasn't been great for the Stallions, especially this past year, but they still have a very strong fan base. In fact, Birmingham's been one of the best markets for the UFL when it comes to TV over the past couple years. In fact, this number is from 2025, and Birmingham, Alabama was actually the top TV market for the UFL that year. Now, I haven't seen anything specifically related to 2026, although once again I would imagine Birmingham is near the top. So even though the attendance for the Stallions isn't amazing, they still clearly have a strong fan base for the Stallions, and it's still one of your stronger markets. And then, when talking about attendance for the Stallions, I also think you have to factor in the fact that weather is just not the greatest there, because it is hot, and it rains a lot, so it's not always the most ideal conditions to be attending a football game in. And one last reason I wouldn't move the Stallions is they've been one of the biggest brands in spring football over the past few years because of the success they had from 2022 to 2024. Because if you ask the average football fan to name a spring football team, chances are they're going to say the Stallions. So I just don't think you can move on from a fan base that is clearly there, or a brand that has been one of your biggest brands for years now. So you definitely would not move the Stallions. Now, as far as the Gamblers go, I definitely think they have the better argument of the two to get relocated, because they've now been pretty bad in terms of attendance for a couple years now, although I still would not move the Gamblers. Because Houston, that's a big sports city, and we've seen Houston be good for spring football, as back in 2020 with the Roughnecks, they were one of the better teams when it comes to attendance. Now, obviously, I know a lot has changed in not only spring football but the world since 2020, but there's still a lot of potential, and even if the UFL can just get some of that fan base back, there's still a lot of potential for a team to be successful in Houston. Now, one more thing when it comes to relocation, and this isn't exactly leaving a city, but it's the Battlehawks. Now, they're not going to leave St. Louis because that would be the dumbest thing ever, but I have seen rumors they could go move out of the Dome and move to Energizer Park, which is a soccer field in St. Louis. And I'm not the biggest fan of that idea. Now, I know paying for the Dome was probably pretty expensive, especially when you're only really using the lower bowl, but I think the Dome gives the Battlehawks a unique home field advantage, and it also makes it unique with them being the only team in the league to play indoors. And it also allows you to have as many fans as possible, because if you sell out of tickets, you could always just open up more seats. Whereas if you move to Energizer Park, that stadium only holds 22 to 23,000, and that would definitely not be ideal for the UFL when most Battlehawks games have way more than that. And, I mean, that was even true this past year, when the Battlehawks had a very down year when it comes to attendance. Most of their games were still over 22,000. So, the UFL would definitely have to evaluate if it makes more sense to pay for a cheaper stadium but sell less tickets, or to keep paying for the Dome and hope the attendance numbers for the Battlehawks go back up. But if I was the UFL, I would like to see the Battlehawks stay in the Dome, although with the way it's looked, I would not be surprised to see them playing Energizer Park in 2027. But overall, relocating teams to new cities is not something I would really consider for the UFL this year, especially because you want to show your loyalty to these cities, because we just saw the move out of Memphis, San Antonio, and Michigan, and you want to show the fans in these cities that you're going to commit to the cities and not just move teams if things go south, and not physically move the team south. But that is another reason I just wouldn't relocate teams. And moving on to some changes we could see for the UFL moving forward. But the first thing is what I really think the UFL needs to focus on, and that's growing the league, and that obviously starts with marketing. And I think poor marketing is really the reason we've seen attendance drop from 2024 to 2026. And from what I've heard, UFL local marketing is pretty bad. Now, I don't live in a UFL city living in New Jersey, so I don't know firsthand, but from what I've seen people say online, local marketing for the UFL is not good. So I definitely think that's got to be priority number one for the UFL this offseason, to just improve local marketing, and that, by default, kind of help your attendance problem. Now, another popular talking point about the UFL of things they could change going to 2027 is when they start the season. Because I've seen a lot of people online say the UFL should start the season a few weeks earlier. And even co-owner Mike Rapoli said he's considering doing that. But I actually disagree with that. Now, if they want to start training camp earlier, I'm perfectly fine with that. And I would actually encourage that, because that would give the offenses a few more weeks to actually get going. Because over the past couple years, we've seen the offenses take a few weeks into the regular season to actually start scoring some points. So starting training camp earlier, I definitely think could solve that problem. But when it comes to the actual season, I like starting it late March, and I would not move it earlier for a few reasons. The first reason is starting the year in late March, it gives your average football fan time from the end of the NFL season to the start of the UFL season, where they can start to kind of miss football a little bit during that period. So I think it makes sense, and you don't want to have it start like on top of the NFL season ending. So I definitely wouldn't consider starting it even late February or early March. And another reason I wouldn't want to start it in early March to mid-March is that just doesn't make much sense, because then you're competing with the first weekend of March Madness, and that is definitely not a good idea. Now, if you are moving the season start date earlier, it's obviously going to end earlier, so you wouldn't be competing against the NBA and NHL playoffs, although I do think it's a little bit easier trying to schedule games around the playoffs for the NHL and the NBA, as opposed to just directly competing against March Madness. So I definitely would not move the UFL season start date earlier. I like where it is at the end of March, although it seems like that's something the UFL is definitely considering going to 2027. But that is where I'm going to end this video. Even though the attendance numbers were down for the UFL, the viewership numbers were back up, and overall I think they had a pretty successful season in 2026. But thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn notifications. I do my best to post as often as possible, and I will see you in the next video.